Before I get into the details of the presentation itself, I want to provide a little bit of context. First, this is a presentation that I delivered at China Agricultural University on December 3rd, just a couple of weeks ago. And this was the second presentation that I had done at China Agricultural University. The first one was last year, and it was just sort of a first impressions of China presentation by a Western professor from Canada who has been teaching in China now in his 10th year. But this year, it's much more analytical as I get to understand China in much more depth. And so it involves a comparison between China and the West, which of course is quite sensitive. But even last year, I have to get approval. The way it works is I have a contact at China Agricultural University, and she initially approached me a year ago to do a presentation because it's just someone who I happen to meet. And so I did, and it had to get approved at that time. And there was a real kind of attempt to control what I was talking about. But I just rejected it and just said I wouldn't do it if they were going to control me. So this is the second time round. So it actually got rejected the first time, this second year. And so I was quite upset about it because it's based on an article I published on LinkedIn about 2 or 3 months ago. And there was a couple other articles too. So 3 articles. And they've been sitting on LinkedIn for a couple months and hardly anyone has commented about it. And I was looking for much more and expected much more reaction because I was making major assertions. One of which is that the West has not understood China for 700 years. And no one really responded to that. So I was feeling a little bit miffed, I guess. I just wanted someone with some knowledge, like someone to react, just give me a sense of, how accurate I am or how, and so just give me a sense by responding. And so what happened just in my travels throughout China in a recent holiday in October, National Day holiday, I was in the most, basically the center of Chinese civilization. So the one city that has been the capital of China for more dynasties than any other, and it's called Luoyang, and it's in Henan province, which is west of where I am now in Shandong province. And so I just happened to be at a historic park called the Tang Song Dynasty Park, I believe, and there's all sorts of shows and entertainment. And I was looking for a coffee, and I just stumbled across this little coffee shop, and a girl who worked there, we just started chatting. And she was a university student, and that was her hometown. And so she wanted my WeChat details because I was saying I was really interested in Chinese civilization. And so we exchanged WeChat IDs, and I told her that this had become my passion over the years, is trying to demystify Chinese civilization. And so she said, well, have you written anything on it? And I said, yes, I have. And so she wanted to see one of my articles. And so I sent it to her on WeChat, and she read it, and I never asked her to do anything with it. I just sent it. But she actually wrote a review of it and sent it back to me. And it was like the review was so ravingly positive, I couldn't believe it. I'd worked for months on this paper and, it drew upon a lot of knowledge over the years that I'd gained, but I never imagined to get such a glowing review from a student who's actually from the center of Chinese civilization and history in all of China. So Hunan province is where the original of the original Chinese civilization started. The different dynasties, the Shang dynasty, the Xia dynasty, long before China was unified. So anyway, just this profound history. And so I just thought, because I'd already arranged that I was going to do a presentation this year at China Agricultural University, I hadn't settled on a topic. And so this just told me, oh, I've got to do it on this. It seems like I got it right. So this is what I'll do my presentation on. And so she was basically the trigger for me to start developing this PowerPoint presentation for Chinese Agricultural University. And then later I came across another student, another one who was not one of my students, and she was from the periphery of China, Hainan Island in the deep south, roughly near Hong Kong. Most Westerners, I'm sure, have probably never heard of Hainan Island or even Luoyang. And so, but she was from the periphery of China, and she was saying similar things. She was amazed how well I portrayed Chinese culture and civilization. And so that really confirmed it for me. So that's why I submit, that's what led to the PPT. And initially, it wasn't the PPT that was submitted. It was just a written sheet of paper that summarized what it was about, and that's what they rejected. So my contact at China Agricultural University, she thought she just didn't provide enough information. And so she felt very badly, and because she thought it had potential. And so I just said, can we try again? So we had to ask, can we resubmit our application again? And the powers that be said, yes, you can. And we did. And we rushed it through. And she really dedicated her time to getting it approved. And so a couple days later, it was approved. And I never imagined, I just thought, there's people, and obviously with the Communist Party of China involved in deciding whether this is accepted, like at the university. And so I just never imagined that they would change their minds. I thought the first time a no means no, basically. But they did. They changed their mind. But what happened is that I also wanted to videotape it so that I could post it on the presentation on YouTube, like I'm planning to do. And I also wanted to do a little survey confirming the accuracy of what the details that I talk about in China. And both of them got rejected. Videotaping, they just plain don't allow it. And data collection, they didn't want that either. That was a little too sensitive. And so I had to go ahead without the video presentation, without getting videotaped. And so that's why I'm recreating the actual presentation. I wrote detailed notes about what I presented, or I had detailed notes of the whole presentation, what I was going to say, and so I still have those same notes right here. So this is practically identical to the presentation that I actually did. And so I am recreating the presentation to post so the whole world can see. And so anyway, that's just the bit of background I want to give, and let's get into the presentation itself. Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to tell you exactly what you will gain from the next 60 minutes. This isn't just a lecture about culture. This is a practical lens that will help you solve 3 very real problems. First, the why am I so homesick problem. You will understand why moving to a new city for university can feel biologically disorienting, even if it's only 200 kilometers away. It's not a weakness. It's the signal of a 5,000-year-old operating system. I will give you the code to read that signal. Number 2, the why is it so hard to make foreign friends problem. You will stop blaming your English and your shyness. You will see it as a clash of social software. I will show you the user manual for the Western system, so you can finally navigate it with strategy, not stress. Third, the who am I supposed to be problem. You are pulled between tradition and modernity, family expectation, and personal ambition. The talk will give you a new framework, a civilizational identity that turns that tension from a burden into a source of strength. You will see your roots not as chains, but as your unique power source. The tool we will use is a simple map, a map of my family, which looks like a chaotic international airline diagram, and the map of your families, which in the room of 100 or so people, in this room of 100 or so people, will likely show a profound concentration in one place, China. The difference between these two maps explains your homesickness, your friendship challenges, and your deepest questions about identity. Let me show you how. Before I show you the map, I'd like to start with the story of my family. On my father's side, I know that his mother's father came to Ireland, but I have no idea what village he was from in Germany. I don't have any stories about him, and I don't know what country he is buried in. Similarly, I don't know where my father's father is buried, nor my mother's mother and mother's father are buried in New Zealand, let alone visit their grave sites. This was something I never thought about growing up in Canada, where most of my friends were first or second generation Canadians. That is, until I moved to China. This disconnection has a name. Sociologists call it alienation, and today we're going to explore how this feeling is not just personal, but is shaped by the very structure of our civilizations. Almost from the beginning of my teaching in China, I have reminded my students of our diverse cultural backgrounds at the start of each course by pulling out a map of the world and asking if they have a parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent who was born outside of China. The answer for each class has been a consistent no, no, and no. Then I show them a map of the world with lines linking Toronto, Canada, where I was born, to the countries from which my ancestors came, starting with my parents, to represent the West, particularly settler societies like the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. For instance, to represent my mother, a first-generation immigrant to Canada, a line connects Toronto and New Zealand, where she was born. Since my family has lived in New Zealand for 8 generations, that is the only line that represents my mother's side. In contrast, for my father's side, a line connects Toronto with England, where he was born. Then there is another line connecting England with Ireland, where my grandmother is from. Then yet another line connects Ireland with Germany, from which my great-grandfather emigrated. Consequently, my family's ancestors represent a greater diversity of nationalities than those of the more than 1,000 Chinese students I have taught over 10 years in China. Here, I'm just zooming in on New Zealand, just showing you how I represent the 8 generations of my family on my mother's side of the family. And then this is zooming in for my father's side of the family. First is just showing my father is the first immigrant coming to Canada, and second is representing his mother, my grandmother. And you can see the connection between England and Ireland. And third represents my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, who is from Germany. And I haven't even talked about my surname, Robson, yet. The Robson ancestral line can be traced back 900 years to Scotland. These are our family clan and coat of arms. So family tartan and family coat of arms. So the ancestral seat, or Jiguan, of the Robson family is in southern Scotland and northern England. And I'll show you exactly. It's actually on both sides of the border, but it originally comes from Scotland. So you can see Robson's here, occurs once, but you can see here on the Scottish side, Robson's here, Robson's here, and Robson's here, 3 places. Although this simple exercise consistently impresses all who hear it and makes the differences stark, like a fish in water, we are unconscious of it as one of the most fundamental cultural differences between Western and Chinese civilizations. I did not know it at the then, but it turns out that this simple exercise holds the key to understanding not just our classroom, but the clashes and silences that define our world. Before we move any further, I want to define alienation. I get this definition from a famous book written by Robert Nisbet, an American sociologist. The initial title of the book was The Quest for Community, which was published in 1953. And then it was revised in 1962, Community and Power. So his definition of alienation is a state of mind that can find a social order remote, incomprehensible, or fraudulent. Basically, in a word, it's where someone feels disconnected from their society. Considering that my PhD focused on community forestry, I have a PhD in forestry, and involved a wide range of disciplines in both the social and natural sciences, I thought the idea of using a biological frame of a forest as a metaphor to clarify the cultural differences between Western, especially settler, hyper-individualistic societies like the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and Chinese hyper-collectivist civilizations might make it easier to navigate and discuss otherwise sensitive cultural issues, provide a common language to facilitate understanding of some of the arcane terms in Chinese civilization, and most importantly, move the discussion beyond economics, which emphasizes mere utility. In contrast, the topic of rootedness versus migration shapes the very biological and social context of a person's life, which in turn influences their vulnerability to alienation. For the Chinese context, think of a giant ancient tree with a deep and vast root system intertwined with the roots of other ancient trees. It draws nutrients from the soil its ancestors have conditioned for generations. Its existence is defined by its complex, stable, interconnected relationship with a specific ecosystem. Now imagine a person born into a pre-existing dense web of biological and social connections. Your family, your ancestors, your village, or your city, your native place, or guxiang, are all part of your ecosystem. Your body, in a sense, is an extension of this deeply rooted system. Your health is not just an individual concern, but a matter of continuity for the entire network. As a result, Chinese civilization, deeply rooted in a specific place, not only draws sustenance from a historical and familial past, but has an identity inseparable from its ecosystem. This is why I call China the ancient forest civilization. In contrast, for the Western settler context, think of a seedling that germinated from a seed carried by the wind across an ocean. It grows in soil that is new to its genetic line. It must adapt to different nutrients, different microbes, and different neighboring species. Its survival depends on its own resilience and its ability to form new, chosen connections in a novel environment. Now imagine a person as a discrete biological unit whose primary responsibility is to itself. Family lines have been severed and reestablished in new lands. Your body is your own first and foremost. The primary project is individual survival and success in a system you must navigate independently. The strength of Western civilization, defined by its mobility and adaptability, lies in resilience and the ability to establish new roots in new soil, often at the cost of severing ties to the past. This is why I call the West, especially the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the transplanted garden civilization. So this is just showing this book that was originally called Quest for Community, which is now called Community and Power, that Robert Nisbet wrote, an American sociologist. And what I want to highlight here is that this book is considered so culturally important to Western civilization, it can be freely copied in the US. So there's no copyright. So following along in this book, I want to introduce the four different types of alienation. We've just talked about alienation in general, but there's four types. So breaking alienation into a finer scale of analysis by applying Nisbet's alienation framework reveals the following four fragments of alienation. The first, starting on the upper left, is alienation from the past. And so what that is right here, disconnection from history, tradition, and ancestry, which we've already been talking about. And then the next type of alienation is alienation from place and nature. And that relates to the loss of deep, meaningful connection to the environment. And then the third type is alienation from property, which is about disconnection from legacy and any kind of stable anchor in your family line. So a good example of this would be a family home passed down from generation to generation would be lack of alienation. So where that's not going on, you tend to have lower or higher alienation. And then in the very last one, alienation from community. So that's where you have a loss of a pre-woven social fabric. And the idea is the country where your ancestors moved from, they would have been embedded in a community. And because they've migrated, they've lost that pre-woven social fabric. So basically, they have to create their own new community in the new world. These are the fractures that can occur between an individual and their world. Different societies experience them differently. We've explored the landscape of alienation, the disconnection, the powerlessness, the isolation. Now let us pause and imagine its antidote. In this next section, we will construct a theoretical model of a community in a state of wholeness. This is a thought experiment, a vision of the social ecosystem where alienation cannot take root. Let's give this model a face. Imagine a community where labor is not abstracted, but meaningful, where the farmer sees the fruit of their work nourishing neighbors, where social bonds are not transactional, but are the very fabric of identity. This is a place of belonging, where the individual and group are not in conflict, but harmony. Think of this model as a healthy, thriving tree. Its strength comes from its deep roots, the layered, intermediate communities that nourish it. The trunk is the individual, strong and whole, and the canopy is the visible, fruitful output of a purposeful life. This is a system in balance. What's important to understand is that this is not just a nostalgic fantasy. The principles I'm talking about of this model, connection, purpose, and agency, are timeless. We see their modern expression in collaborative communities, whether in urban gardens, tech cooperatives, or research teams seeking sustainable development. This vision provides our compass. We now have a definition. Alienation is this rupture, this state of disconnection from our work, our community, and ourselves. But definitions can feel abstract, so let's make it visceral. Let's use this definition as a lens to see the story of alienation unfold. We'll start with a vision of wholeness and then witness the fracture. So the next section I call From Wholeness to Fracture, where we trace a community becoming more and more alienated. First, visualize a thriving multi-generational village. This is the ancient forest in its full health. Here, every role has a purpose. The farmer, the baker, the elder, the child, all are connected in a visible web of mutual support. This is a society where alienation is kept at bay by a profound sense of belonging. Labor is meaningful, identity is rooted, and the community is an extension of the self. So this is where we find intermediate associations, which refer to anything intermediate between the overall community and the individual. So examples, family, the guild, union hall, the local church, or the local council. So these form the roots of this whole community that people get nourished by. And in this healthy society, the individual is whole. Their identity is not a solitary struggle, but a rich tapestry woven from their relationships, heritage, and work. They are a rooted tree, drawing strength from the deep soil of their community. This is the antithesis of the alienated, isolated self. So the idea is a trunk represents the individual in these whole communities, and it represents the integrated individual. And the leaves and branches represent the vibrant expression of life. But now a blight settles in. The first symptom is not yet the internal feeling, but the external fact, disconnection. The warm, visible web of relationships begins to fray. The communal square falls silent, replaced by private, anonymous transactions. The bonds that gave the individual their strength, the family, the guild, the local community, weaken. This is the social structure crumbling. So you can see in the background here, the guild hall has become a generic, sleek government building as alienation sets in, and the once bustling market has been replaced by a silent, automated delivery hub, as represented by this robot. The farmer, who is the gentleman on the right, now looks at a smartphone display of commodity futures for his crop. His connection to the consumer is broken. And when disconnection becomes the norm in the community, the internal reality catches up. This is the full flowering of alienation. The individual is now isolated, turned away from their community and even from their own labor. They are surrounded by abstractions, data, markets, screens, while the tangible, living world of purpose and connection, as represented by the sunflower on the other side of the window, is out of reach. This is the human consequence of the blight, a state of powerlessness and meaninglessness. So how did we get here? And what can this journey from wholeness to fracture tell us about potential paths forward? So the farmer has been reduced to a monitor of abstracted information, separated from the tangible fruits of his labor and the community he once sustained. So disconnected from growing and disconnected from the people he's selling to. Before we go further, I want to share where this presentation came from. It wasn't just from research, but a conversation. These ideas began as an article I published on LinkedIn. After I talked about it with a couple of students I met in China, they asked me to share it. Following months with virtually no response on LinkedIn, as I mentioned earlier, the sheer depth of the Chinese students' reviews was thrilling. Finally, I had found people who knew what I was talking about. For instance, the student I met in Luoyang wrote, "Just finished reading your article. Seriously, it was such an interesting and thoughtful read. I absolutely love the ancient tree versus seedling metaphor. It's so vivid that it makes those abstract cultural differences between the East and the West feel super easy to understand, especially when you tied it to things we Chinese know well, like Qingming traditions or Jiguan. What really stuck with me was how you explain those little daily experiences I've had, but never looked into deeply. Like why Chinese students sometimes find it hard to make foreign friends abroad. Or even the thing about bringing hometown soil when traveling. My grandma does that too. This was basically a story that I mentioned in the article about my boss here at Ludong University in Yantai telling us teachers about her grandparents whenever they would travel in China, and often they would get homesick. So what they would do is bring soil from their hometown with them, and when they started to get homesick, they would just get a fingerful and sprinkle that soil into a glass of water and drink it to relieve them of their homesickness. And so I talk about this story in my article, and here is a girl from, hundreds of kilometers away from where I am in a totally different province. She's saying her grandmother does the same thing. And so this was just earth-shaking to hear, wow, this isn't just a story from one province. And so she just loved that. Your take on alienation gave me a whole new perspective on those moments. Thanks so much for sharing this with me. It made me think more about cross-cultural stuff in a warm, relatable way. Not just some academic idea. Really loved it. Now the second student, was from Sanya, which is the deep south of China on an island called Hainan. The second student from Sanya, who I met here at my university, said, I have read your article carefully. It's amazing. I think the views are very correct. As a Chinese, I deeply agree with the metaphor of ancient trees and seedlings you mentioned, especially when comparing the understanding of home and sense of belonging by Chinese and Western students. I have similar observations, such as my obsession with the weather in my hometown, which made me realize for the first time place can be so deeply embedded in a personal body. So she's talking about something else I referred to that I discovered students here, first-year students, would complain about the weather being so different from their hometown. And I'm going, you only live a few hundred kilometers away, but they insisted they could feel it in their bodies. They just are having a difficult time adjusting to first-year university because the weather was so different, and they were only a few hundred kilometers from their hometown. Things like this just totally blew me away. I'd never heard of such a thing. So comments like these were incredibly validating. They told me that this lens wasn't just an academic theory. It resonated with the lived experience of the people I described. The way the Chinese students saw their own lives reflected in this framework particularly moved me. This is especially after getting virtually no response on LinkedIn, which basically told me no one had a clue, which reinforces an idea I've been developing that the West is completely clueless about China. So here's a little quote from the girl representing the girl from Luoyang, which is basically the north and the east of China, northeast central, I guess, north central, but tending towards the east. What really stuck with me was how you explain those daily experiences I've had. So she was from Luoyang, as I say, that used to be the capital of China for 13 dynasties from Henan province. And then there's the girl from Sanya, Hainan Island. And here's a quote of hers I've already mentioned. I have similar observations, such as my obsession with weather in my hometown of Sanya, Hainan. The Great Divergence, Two Civilizations, Four Fractures. Now we're going to get into a comparison of Chinese and Western civilization based on the four dimensions of alienation, four types. First, we'll talk about alienation from the past. This model often views the past as something to be overcome, whereas in China, there is a profound cultural emphasis on historical continuity. The past is a source of wisdom, identity, and moral authority, for example, through Confucian values. This creates a powerful sense of belonging to a long, unbroken civilizational story, acting as a strong buffer against this form of alienation. In the Chinese context, the individual is like an ancient tree with branches that extend back millennia. The low alienation from the past is maintained through annual rituals, such as the Qingming Festival holiday, also known as Tomb Sweeping Day in English. The importance of genealogy, Jia Pu, and the concept of Jiguan, one's ancient native place, as recorded in the family's official registration history, passed down from father to child, like a surname, evidence of the past as a living resource in China. So this is something I'm sure most people have no idea. This idea of an ancestral native place. It's actually written on your documentation. I believe it's your birth certificate or it's your ID. It's your ID in China. It has your ancestral native place. So these aren't things just from the past. So again, this is about remembering the ancestors. Qingming Festival is a classic. It's actually a holiday every year. I experienced it first time when the students were going home for the Qingming Festival. And basically they were going with their families to the graves of their ancestors to clean up the gravesite, maybe to put flowers there, maybe leave some food, that kind of thing. So this is like an annual holiday. And it's, in the end, I've recently discovered, it's only one of 3 times in a year that you visit your ancestors' graves, like as a group, as a special recognition, in addition to all the other times that you might go. The other thing is the genealogy, which I've witnessed myself, and say grandparents in a village will often have like a little shrine to their ancestors so they know, so they're in touch with who they are and remembering them. And then this idea of Jiguan, the ancestral native place, as I said, this is literally recorded, passed down generation to generation on your identification, what your Jiguan is. And so when it comes to alienation from the past, in the Chinese context, I judge it as low alienation. And here's just a picture of my first experience with the Qingming Festival, seeing students heading home for the long weekend. And it's a holiday, and so this is all to honor the ancestors. just a whole mindset, just so alien to me growing up in Canada. I mean, here I already talked about, I don't even know where most of my ancestors are even buried, which I don't even know which country. And so where to find them. And so I am just so profoundly disconnected from my ancestors compared to anyone in China. So, in contrast, in the Western settler context, progress is defined by a break with tradition and innovation. This can lead to a rootless identity where history is a museum piece rather than a living guide, fostering a sense of cultural amnesia. You see this in the story I told you at the beginning. My family's history, within a few generations, became a series of question marks. The past wasn't a continuous story. It was a door that closed behind my ancestors when they moved. This is a classic symptom of the transplanted garden civilization, a rootlessness where the soil of history is very shallow. Contrast this with the ancient forest, where knowing your ancestry for generations is the cornerstone of identity. My personal map of ancestors across 4 countries exemplifies this. The connection is genealogical, but not necessarily rooted in a continuous place-based tradition. So migration causes a break with the past and a break to the connection to ancestral graves and traditional landscapes and the continuous community. Your relations with the community is severed because you've migrated, your ancestors, in my case, my parents. So when it comes to alienation from the past, in the Western settler context, alienation is high. And I just wanted to show this is largely the kind of connection we have to our ancestors, if any, in the West. This is not, for every single person, but the vast majority of us who've migrated from another country. So our connection to our ancestors, our websites, searching maybe all sorts of data and documents that are online to trace where our ancestors come from. It's not going to their gravesite and cleaning up graves, is the point I'm trying to make, which Chinese are doing regularly and have made an actual holiday for one of those times of the year. And so here's another demonstration. This is actually with my family, where family members, Robson family members, I'm not even one of them. I don't know any of these people, but the Robson family name, they've set up a website where they can do research on the roots of the Robsons. And you can also get DNA testing done to figure out where you come from, where your ancestors are. And I'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, and the second type of alienation we're going to be talking about is alienation from place and nature. This is the disconnect between the individual and a specific meaningful geographic environment. This is embodied in the deep cultural connection to a specific homeland as defined by personal history and feelings, gusheng, one of the most emotionally resonant words in the Chinese language. The intense emotion associated with returning home for the Spring Festival is a direct antidote to alienation from place. The place where Chinese grew up is not just a location, it is the bedrock of one's identity. especially in Shandong province as the heartland of Chinese civilization, where I am living now, and I have been lived for 7 years now. For people from Shandong, their hometown's weather, food, and dialect are not just preferences. They are part of their identity. Gusheng explains a curious phenomenon, at least to someone from a Western settler society like me, that I witnessed among the first-year students who had to move to Ludong University here, where I teach, most of whom were away from home for the first time. When discussing their difficulties adjusting, many mentioned struggling to adapt to the different weather conditions, often despite their hometown being only a few hundred kilometers away. This attachment to the weather in their hometown was a direct reflection of their attachment to the entire complex system of their gusheng, the food, the dialect, the family, the streets, and even the climate. This longing for gusheng, xiangchou, or homesickness, nostalgia, has been a central theme in Chinese art and literature for generations. So alienation from place in China is low. So this concept of a native place, Jiguan, and Gusheng, hometown, where you grew up, and then this other concept of Shangqiu, nostalgia. So when it comes to the second type of alienation, alienation from place and nature, in the Chinese context, it's low. And again, in contrast, in the Western settler context, place can become interchangeable. A subdivision, an office park. The relationship with nature is often instrumental and managerial. This fosters a disconnect from the specific spiritual essence of a particular landscape, leading to an ecological and spiritual alienation. While people do develop a love for places, it is a chosen connection, different from the inherited fatalistic connection of the ancient tree civilization of China. So place is just a matter of opportunity, cost of living, and climate, whether it's a good climate, where home is portable and chosen, not inherited. So, for the Western settler context, alienation from place and nature is high. Now, this map, I said I would be coming back to DNA. This is from the Robson website, and I thought this was really fascinating that I should mention it. That alienation goes back in my family almost 2,000 years, 1,850 years to be exact. And basically, this is the Roman Empire. It's showing it in AD 14 and then AD 117. And we'll get into this. So this is a quote from one of the reports on the Robson website. One of our members is haplogroup J2. This is their DNA. J2 has been traced back to the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea that comprises territory in northwestern Iraq and Iran, eastern Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. So this was a complete shock to me, a new realization to show what happened 1,850 years ago. I have ancestry going back to this region, and it happened around this time, why people from this region ended up here, where basically the Robson family name comes from. Now remember, Robson family name only goes back 900 years, so this is another 900 years before that. But it's all along in the same area, the border between Scotland and England. Specifically in this case, with the Romans, Hadrian's Wall. One theory offered for the presence of J2 in northern England is the presence of Roman auxiliary soldiers stationed on Hadrian's Wall. It has been suggested that the original J2 ancestor of our Robson member may have been a Sarmatian horseman in the Roman legion. And so again, these people, I'd never heard of them before, but Sarmatian horsemen. So one of my ancestors was a Sarmatian horseman, it looks like, who came from this region, who engaged in a battle against Marcus Aurelius and lost. And this is around AD 175, I believe. And so because they lost, there is an agreement that Marcus Aurelius could send them way off to a distant part of the Roman Empire, the most distant part. He actually sent them way up here to northern England. And so that's why the DNA has been discovered in the Robson family line. Now, this is 900 years before the Robsons, but they patrolled the Hadrian Wall on horses. They were some of the best horsemen in Europe at the time, best cavalry. And so the Romans learned from them and had them as a separate unit. And so they ended up settling there because they were like so far away from their homeland, they never returned. And so they ended up intermarrying along in the same region and eventually connected to the Robsons. And so, yeah, just incredible stories. So the key point I want to get is that this is alienation, big time, of place at least. These people, the Sarmatian horsemen, are coming from sort of a hot, dry grassland area, and they're moving to a cold, wet, forested area in northern England. So alienation was happening in my family thousands of years ago. And the thing to get is that this is very different from the history of China. So alienation from property is the next category. In the Chinese context, property is a social and familial vessel. This is property as a tangible extension of the self and one's labor, rooted in a context. Example, a family farm, for instance. While this has changed dramatically with modern capitalism, the cultural residue remains. Property is seen as a means of security and a legacy for the next generation, thereby tethering the family to a place. Its value is deeply tied to its role in sustaining the family unit across generations, resisting pure financial abstraction. So alienation from property is medium, I'm calling it in this case. So capitalism is influencing China. So this is why I've changed it to medium instead of low. But despite this change by capitalism, property is still viewed as a means of security and a legacy for the next generation in China. and still tethers family to a place. And I hear this all the time. I hear people will live in the house with their parents in maybe an urban area, a city, but they'll regularly go visit their grandparents' place, which will be in the traditional family home. So that is not sold off. So they basically have two places apparently. And this is what I've heard from one of my students. So when it comes to the third type of alienation, alienation from property, in the Chinese context, as I said, is medium. And once again, in contrast, in the Western settler context, property is predominantly abstracted as a financial asset. It's fungible, tradable, and often leveraged. Its value is detached from its use or personal history. This abstraction can alienate the individual from the deeper sense of stewardship and personal identity that comes with owning a specific beloved place. So predominantly, property in the West is predominantly a commodity and an instrument of wealth, individual wealth and security. So it's not about tradition, it's not about a history, it's not about attachment to place. So when it comes to alienation from property in the Western settler context, alienation is high. Now we move to the last type of alienation, alienation from community. In the Chinese context, community is less chosen and more given. It is based on enduring obligatory relationships of family, clan, and known social circles, guanxi. This provides a powerful, inescapable safety net and a clear, if sometimes demanding, social identity, offering a robust defense against the isolation of a purely voluntary society. While this has been constrained by modernity, the cultural template and expectation of embeddedness remain powerful. For example, I noticed that among my first-year students who had to move away from their hometown for the first time, many mentioned missing a sibling so much. Something I had never heard first-year Canadian students ever say. As a result, loneliness in China is perceived not as an individual condition, but a profound social failure. Therefore, the baseline alienation from the community is low. So basically, family is viewed as a fundamental cell of society. So guanxi relationships are tight relationships, people that you know. So they're about your in-group. You have guanxi relationships versus an out-group, someone you don't know. And the thing is, you're born into this in China. You're born into community. You don't have to create it. So when it comes to the last type of alienation, alienation from community, in the Chinese context, it's low. But once again, in contrast, in the Western settler context, community is often a matter of choice, a social network of like-minded individuals. These bonds can be strong, but they can also be fragile and optional. When these chosen networks fail or feel insufficient, it can lead to a profound sense of social isolation and a lack of obligatory mutual support. Therefore, the potential for alienation from the community is high. It's because these are voluntary, they're not obligatory. So this is where it's different compared to China. So in the West, as individuals, we must build our own communities. So associations that we create, maybe like a soccer association, are all based on choice, whether we join them or not. Do we participate? It's not obligation. So community can be vibrant because you're choosing the kind of community you want to live in, but it can also be optional and fragile because it's by choice. It's not by obligation. So, for the last type of alienation for the Western settler context, alienation from community is high. Okay, the next part I wanted to get in is this little case study showing basically about why it's challenging for Chinese students to go to the West and attend university. And so this is something I have experience with firsthand because I used to teach Chinese students at a top high school, and the students all went to Western universities around the world, top universities. And so I heard all about this problem, which I didn't know anything about before I taught these students. And that is that Chinese students, and it's well known in China, that they find it very difficult to make Western friends. And so I came across an article called exactly this: Why is it hard to make Western friends? And it was by a girl who called herself Jamintz, who's from Beijing. And so it's 9 years old, but it still goes on, and it has forever. And here's a couple of quotes from that article. My friends were so unhappy that all the Chinese seemed to enjoy the party closely, but excluded them. In the eyes of a Chinese, foreigners are someone distinctively different and cannot be regarded as the same. So these are two different quotes representing what it was about. The first one is about the unhappy friends, were about her international friends, and I'll tell you more about them next. So here's Jamintz continuing on. Apart from the differences of having outgoing activities, Chinese students have impressed a lot of Westerners by their shyness. For example, in a party with my Western friends, my Chinese friends usually stayed quiet and finally became very good listeners. And later, they would say, "My God, I felt so nervous that everybody was so active. And I just looked at all you guys talking, but had absolutely no idea what to talk about. Your Western friends are very nice, but I still feel there is a distance between us." So this is a sense having difficulty. They just didn't have this tradition of meeting new people, because in China you're born into your community. So continuing on, often Chinese think Westerners are too blunt and fast in conversations, and that makes them nervous. As a result, they would stay silent and enjoy listening to the words shooting among the foreigners. And for Westerners, Chinese are reacting way too slow and sometimes a bit weird, because they don't have any idea that Chinese are actually slow in this regard. Anyways, I may describe the Chinese communication as a game of Tai Chi that takes both time and brain to discover, and Westerners as like shooting a ball, direct and simple. So this is an example of two operating systems, completely different, clashing. You have the Chinese one where you have ascribed relationships that they're born into, family, hometown classmates, university classmates, colleagues. You didn't choose those people. You're just born into it. It was given to you. You didn't have to expend effort to meet these people. And then now you've gone to the West, say the US, and suddenly you have to meet people and you don't know how to. You don't have a history of doing this. And so this is what makes it very challenging for them. It's not about English, it's about a whole social operating system that's completely different. And so this is getting into the details of how different they are. So let's go through the 4 different features here of these different types of relationships, or the 2, the ascribed, the difference between ascribed and achieved relationships. So when it comes to China, we talk about ascribed relationships. So the basis for those the basis is who you are by circumstance, your family, your birthplace, your ethnicity, your class. In contrast, in the Western settler societies, the relationships are achieved. So it's all about what you do and what you choose, your interests, your career, your voluntary associations. And then moving on to the second feature, the process by which you have these relationships. In China, it's just automatic. It's inherited. It's organic. The relationships are given to you. But in the West, it's intentional, effort-based, and constructed. So you have to build your relationships. And examples of each of these, first let's talk about ascribed. Example would be your relationship with your parents in China, or your bond with people from your hometown, or your connection to your classmates simply by sharing a classroom. And I witness this all the time. I've experienced this. And also duty to your relatives. And in contrast, in the Western settler societies, friendships are based on, maybe a friendship you developed at the gym with someone you met, a gym buddy, a network of people that you met at a professional conference. Maybe the bond you developed with members of a volunteer club you joined, or a found family, a group of people you came across when you moved to a new community. And then now moving to the last category, last feature, the social grammar involved. For ascribed relationships, the rules are well understood and based on fixed hierarchies and mutual obligation. Examples would be filial piety, so like loyalty to your father, your parents, loyalty to old friends. Whereas in the West, in the Western settler society context, the rules are fluid. It's based on interests, how you negotiate your friendships, and compatibility. Very different. So now we come to the conclusion. 2 roots, 1 planet. So I've outlined a tale of 2 systems. We've explored 2 deeply different coherent models of being. The rooted ancient forest of China and the mobile transplanted garden of Western settler societies. These aren't moral choices, but historical adaptations. One prioritizes continuity and ecosystem stability, China. The other, resilience and individual agency. This fundamental difference in belonging and alienation is the operating system underneath many of our cultural clashes and silences, from friendship to climate change, climate action. But the story doesn't end there. So, as we wrap up our comparison today, I want to leave you with this thought: understanding the ancient forest and the transplanted garden isn't the end of the conversation. It's actually the master key that unlocks the door to understanding our entire world. What we've done today is establish the two core polar models. One, a civilization built on profound continuity with its place and past. The other, a civilization built on remarkable adaptability and the courage to start anew. But our planet isn't just made up of these two types. Think of this as a map. We've just located the North and South poles. But what about all the continents in between? What about the civilizations that had their own ancient forests, violently cut down by colonialism, like Africa, which I call the clear-cut forest civilization, and are now in a painful, heroic struggle to regrow? And what about the original ancient forests of Europe, which, after being heavily pruned by their own industrialization and wars, what I call the pruned ancient forest civilization, are now trying to build bureaucratic greenhouses to manage the alienation they both suffered and spread? The clashes and misunderstandings we see globally often stem from the very fact that these other civilizations are operating from their own unique points on the spectrum of belonging and alienation. So, the next time you see a confusing international headline or a conflict that seems irrational, I encourage you to ask, is this clash between a forest and a garden civilization? Or is one of the other models, the clear-cut or the pruned forest civilization, in the room? Thank you. You now have a lens to see the world not just as a collection of nations, but as an ecosystem of civilizations, each with a profoundly different relationship to the past, to place, and to each other.